For nearly 4,500 years, a ship lay hidden in the ground beside the Great Pyramid, sealed in darkness so complete that no light and almost no air had reached it since the day the last stone was lowered into place. It had never sailed the sea. It had never, so far as anyone can say for certain, carried a cargo or a crew across open water, and yet it was a real ship, full-sized and finely made, more than 40 meters from the curve of its prow to the tall sweep of its stern, built from cedar carried across the eastern sea from the distant hills of Lebanon. When the men who buried it slid the final block over the pit and turned back toward the daylight, the pyramid above them was new. Its casing stones were still bright and unweathered. The Pharaoh whose name the ship carries had only lately been laid to rest, and there, in the shadow of the largest structure anyone in the world had yet built, the ship began the longest and stillest voyage of its existence, a voyage measured not in miles but in the slow turning of the ages, waiting in the dark while empires rose and fell far above it. This is the boat of Khufu. It is sometimes called the Solar Bark, sometimes the Royal Ship of Cheops, using the Greek name by which later travellers knew that same king. But whatever name we give it, it remains one of the oldest large vessels ever found anywhere on Earth, and very nearly the oldest to survive whole. Older ships exist only as fragments, a plank here, a rib there, the ghost of a hull pressed into river mud. This one survived complete, or very nearly so, every timber preserved, every rope channel intact, disassembled with care and packed into its resting place, like a great puzzle waiting patiently for hands that would not arrive for a very long time. To understand how such a thing came to be, and why a king at the height of his power would order a full-size ship built only to be taken apart and buried, we have to travel back to a moment when the very idea of Egypt was still young, when the desert edge west of the river was becoming, stone by stone, the strangest and most ambitious burial ground the ancient world had ever known. The Egypt of that time is often called the Old Kingdom, and the ruling family that shaped it the Fourth Dynasty, though these are labels invented long afterward by scholars looking back across the centuries and trying to make sense of an immense stretch of years. The Egyptians themselves did not think in dynasties. They thought in reigns, in the rise and fall of individual kings, each one a living god upon the throne, each one responsible for holding back the chaos that pressed always at the edges of the ordered world. The land they governed was a narrow ribbon of green threaded through an ocean of sand, a country made entirely by a single river, the Nile, which flooded each year with a regularity so dependable that it seemed to the people who lived beside it like a promise from the gods themselves. When the waters rose and spread across the fields and then withdrew, they left behind a layer of dark, rich silt, and in that silt the grain grew, and from that grain came the bread and the beer and the surplus that fed the workers, the priests, the scribes, and the kings. Everything in Egypt began with the river. Its ships, its cities, its temples, and in a sense even its dead, all of it grew from the banks of that slow brown water moving north toward the sea. The rhythm of that river governed everything, and it did so with a steadiness that shaped the very way the Egyptians thought about time and order. Each year, in the heat of summer, the Nile would begin to swell, fed by rains that fell far to the south, in lands the Egyptians themselves never saw, and the waters would rise and spread across the low fields on either bank, drowning them beneath a shallow and life-giving flood. For weeks the fields would lie beneath the water, and the villages would stand like little islands above it, and the people would wait, and then, as the season turned, the flood would withdraw, sinking back into its channel and leaving the soaked earth ready for the plough. Upon that dark and renewed soil the farmers would scatter their seed, and through the cooler months the grain would grow, and in the spring it would be gathered in, and the cycle would begin again, year upon year, as dependable as the rising of the sun. So regular was this pattern that the Egyptians built their whole calendar around it, dividing their year into the season of the flood, the season of the growing, and the season of the harvest, and measuring out their lives against the great slow pulse of the river. The building of the pyramid beside which the ship would come to lie was itself an undertaking of a scale that the world had never before seen, and it is worth pausing upon it, for the ship was one small part of a single vast enterprise, and it was made by the same kind of ordered effort that raised the mountain of stone above it. To build the Great Pyramid required the quarrying and moving and lifting of an immense quantity of stone, block upon block, each of them heavy beyond easy reckoning, and the shaping of them, and the setting of them one upon another with a precision that still commands admiration today. Such a work could not have been carried out by a handful of men, nor by gangs driven blindly at the lash, as later legend sometimes imagined, but only by a great and well-organised body of workers, gathered and housed and fed and directed across many years, in what was among the earliest and greatest feats of human organisation, of which any trace remains. The ship in its pit and the pyramid above it were the products of the same remarkable capacity to marshal labour and material toward a single end, sustained with patience across a span of years, and to understand the one it helps to picture the other. Much of what we can say about the people who did this work comes not from grand inscriptions, but from the humbler evidence that the ground has yielded up, the remains of the settlements where the workers lived, the bakeries and the breweries that fed them, the tallies and the markings they left behind. From such traces it appears that the labour was organised into groups, gangs of workers who took a pride in their identity, and who left their names daubed in paint upon the stones they moved, so that here and there upon the hidden faces of the blocks, the cheerful self-given titles of these teams survive, a faint and human voice reaching up out of the deep past. It appears too that many of those who laboured were not slaves at all, but the ordinary people of Egypt, farmers and villagers who gave their strength to the king's great work. Perhaps above all during the season of the flood, when the fields lay drowned beneath the rising Nile, and there was little that could be done upon the land. In that season, when the water covered the earth and the farms could not be worked, the strength of the countryside could be turned to the building of the monuments, and the same flood that fed the fields may also have floated the great stones on their barges to the very edge of the plateau where they were needed. The provisioning of such a workforce was in itself a monumental labour, for a multitude of workers had to be fed day after day across the years of building, and the evidence of the bakeries and the breweries, and of the great quantities of bread and beer and other food that were prepared, gives some sense of the effort that went simply into keeping the builders nourished and able to work. There were overseers to direct the gangs, and scribes to record the materials and the rations and the progress of the work, for the Egyptians were a people who loved to count and to write things down, and the administration of so vast a project demanded a small army of literate officials keeping their careful accounts. All of this, the housing and the feeding and the recording and the directing, formed the great machine of organisation that made the pyramid possible, and it is against this background of patient, disciplined, large-scale effort that we should set the making of the buried ship, for it too was the fruit of the same ordered world, a world in which a king could command the felling of forests across the sea, the gathering of workers from across the land, and the marshalling of every craft toward the raising of monuments meant to last forever. To picture the plateau of Giza in those years is to imagine a place of ceaseless ordered activity, the Great Pyramid rising course by course against the sky, the ramps and the causeways busy with the movement of stone, the workshops loud with the sound of tools, the harbours at the edge of the flood crowded with the barges that brought the stone and the timber and the food. It was, for a time, one of the busiest places in the world, a whole temporary city devoted to a single enormous purpose. And then, when the work was done and the king was laid to rest and the ships were sealed in their pits, the great effort wound down, the workers dispersed, and the plateau grew quiet, left to the priests who tended the royal cult and to the desert wind. The ship, sealed beneath its stones, was one of the last acts of that great enterprise, a final piece of the king's provision put quietly into place as the vast labour drew toward its close, and it kept, in its dark and ordered pit, the memory of the world that had made it, a world of organised hands and counted rations and painted gang names, of ordinary people bending their strength to the will of a god upon the earth. Because the flood was so reliable, and the soil it left behind so rich, the land could produce far more grain than the farmers who worked it needed to feed themselves, and it was this surplus, gathered and stored and carefully administered by the servants of the king, that made everything else in Egypt possible. It fed the quarrymen and the haulers and the masons. It supported the scribes who kept the records and the priests who tended the gods, and the officials who governed the provinces in the king's name. And above all, in the age of the pyramid builders, it fed the vast workforce that raised the great monuments of stone, men who were not, as was once wrongly imagined, slaves driven by the whip, but organised gangs of labourers drawn from the villages of Egypt, housed and fed and set to work in the service of the king, taking their turn at the great works and then returning to their fields. The pyramids were built with bread as much as with stone, with the surplus of the river turned into the muscle, and the time of many thousands of workers, and without the flood and the grain and the surplus that they made together, no pyramid could ever have risen at all. The place where the greatest of those pyramids stands is a low plateau of rock on the western edge of the river valley, near the point where the green of the fields gives way to the pale emptiness of the desert, a site we now call Giza. Here, upon that stony shelf above the floodplain, the kings of the 4th dynasty raised not one pyramid but 3 great ones, along with a host of smaller structures, until the plateau became a whole landscape of stone dedicated to the dead and to their eternal life. The largest of the 3, the Pyramid of Khufu, was the first and the greatest. Beside it, a little later, rose the pyramid of his successor, Khafra, which stands upon slightly higher ground and so can seem, to the eye, almost as tall, and near which crouches the great carved lion with a human face that we call the Sphinx. And beyond these 2 rose a third and smaller pyramid, that of the king Menkaure, completing the group. Around and between the pyramids lay the rest of the great funerary landscape, the temples and the causeways and the rows of smaller tombs, all of it arranged according to a plan whose logic was religious through and through. For a pyramid to the Egyptians was never a lonely monument standing by itself. It was the heart of a whole complex of buildings designed to serve the dead king and to sustain his passage into eternity. Down near the edge of the floodplain, where the river's water could reach, there stood a temple, often called the Valley Temple, a kind of gateway to the sacred precinct, to which the king's body and the offerings for his cult could be brought by water. From this lower temple, a long and roofed causeway climbed up across the desert toward the pyramid, a covered processional way along which the rituals could pass in solemn order. And at the upper end, against the eastern face of the pyramid itself, stood a second temple, the mortuary temple where the offerings were made and the king's spirit honoured day after day by the priests appointed to serve him. The whole arrangement, from the water's edge to the pyramid's flank, was a great machine built for eternity, a structure meant to carry the king across the threshold of death and to keep him supplied and honoured forever. And it was into this landscape, this precinct of water gates and causeways and temples and tombs, that the ship was brought and buried as one more part of the great provision made for the king's unending life. The king remembered as Khufu came to the throne, by the reckoning that most historians now favour, somewhere around 4,600 years ago, though the exact dates are not known and the sources disagree, and any figure given for the precise year of his reign should be understood as an estimate rather than a certainty. What is beyond dispute is that he ordered the building of the largest pyramid ever raised in Egypt, the structure we now call the Great Pyramid of Giza, a mountain of stone so vast that for thousands of years afterward it remained the tallest work of human hands anywhere on the planet. To build it required an organisation of labour and materials on a scale that had never before been attempted, a whole society bent for decades toward a single purpose, quarrying and hauling and lifting millions of blocks of limestone, each one cut and dressed and set in place with a precision that still astonishes those who study it. This was the world into which the ship was born. It was a world that thought in terms of eternity, that measured its achievements not by the span of a single life, but by the endurance of stone across unimaginable reaches of time. A king who could command such a monument could certainly command a ship, and could bury that ship and think nothing strange in doing so. It is one of the quiet ironies of history that we know so little in truth about the man who raised the largest of all the pyramids. Khufu ordered a monument that would keep his name alive for thousands of years, and yet the person behind the name remains almost entirely hidden from us, a shadow at the centre of an enormous work of stone. Of his character, his thoughts, his voice, almost nothing survives. Of his face, we have only a single tiny image that can be identified with any confidence, a small figure of carved ivory no taller than a few centimetres, found not at his great pyramid but far to the south, at an ancient sacred site. And it is a strange thing to reflect that the king of the greatest tomb ever built should be known to us, in the flesh, only through so small and modest a likeness. The vast monument tells us of his power and his ambition and the reach of his kingdom, but of the man himself it is nearly silent, and we are left to imagine him from the scale of what he commanded, rather than from any record of who he was. In much later ages, long after his own time, stories were told about him that cannot be trusted. When the Greek historian who travelled through Egypt some 2,000 years after Khufu's death set down what he had heard about the builder of the Great Pyramid, he recorded tales of a cruel and impious tyrant who had oppressed his people and closed the temples and driven the whole land to labour on his tomb, But these stories were gathered from the memories and legends of a far distant time, passed down through countless generations and coloured by the attitudes of a later age, and modern historians treat them with great caution, for they tell us more about how Khufu was remembered, dimly and unfairly in the centuries that followed, than about the king who actually reigned. The Egyptian records that survive from nearer his own day give no such picture, and the truth of his rule is largely lost to us, so that here again we must be honest about the limits of what can be known, and resist the temptation to fill the silence with confident invention. What we can say is that Khufu did not build in a void, but stood at the summit of a great tradition of pyramid building that his own father had done much to perfect. That father, the king Pharaoh, was one of the most prolific builders in all of Egyptian history, a ruler under whom the very art of raising a true pyramid was worked out through trial and error and hard experience. Under Pharaoh, the builders first attempted a smooth-sided pyramid at one site, and then, at another, raised a great monument whose angle they were forced to change part way up, so that its sides bend inward as they rise, giving it a curious and memorable shape that still puzzles the eye. And then, learning from these efforts, they built for Pharaoh a third Great Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid to be completed successfully, a vast structure that stands to this day. By the time Khufu came to the throne, therefore, the knowledge of how to build such a monument had been won, at great cost and effort, by the generation before him, and he was able to take that hard-earned knowledge and apply it on a scale grander than any that had come before, raising at Giza the largest and most perfect pyramid that Egypt would ever produce. After Khufu, the line continued. His successors carried on the tradition, and one of them, the king Khafre, raised beside his father's monument the second of the three great Giza pyramids, while another figure connected to the family, the king Jedefre, ruled for a time and left his own mark upon the record. It is worth remembering these names and this line of building kings because the ship we are following belongs entirely to their world, made in the same generation and the same tradition that raised the pyramids and buried within the same great funerary landscape. The ship is not a thing apart from the pyramids, but a piece of the same vast project, the same effort to carry a king safely into eternity, and to understand it fully we have to hold it always within that larger frame, as one element of a whole world bent with extraordinary seriousness and extraordinary skill toward the defeat of death. For to the Egyptians the boat was not an afterthought. It was among the most sacred of all objects, woven so deeply into their understanding of the world that they could scarcely imagine the journey of the sun, or the passage of the dead, or the daily life of the gods without it. Their whole cosmos was, in a sense, a thing of water and of sailing. And so, when the builders of Khufu prepared his tomb, they did not forget the ships. They dug pits into the living rock at the foot of the pyramid, and into at least one of them they lowered a complete vessel, dismantled and ordered, and sealed it away with the same care they gave to everything meant to last forever. If you find rest in these long, slow histories of the great ships that people have built across the centuries, you're warmly welcome to follow along and stay a while, for there are many more such voyages to come, and each one waits quietly for a listening ear. Now let us return to the river, and to the reasons a ship of cedar came to lie beneath the sand. To understand why the ship was built, we have to set aside for a moment our modern habit of asking what a thing is for in a purely practical sense, and instead try to enter a way of seeing the world that was older and stranger, and in its own way deeply logical. For the ancient Egyptians, the sky itself was a kind of sea, and across it, each and every day, the sun made a voyage. In the morning the sun god rose in the east, sailing his bright vessel up and across the great arc of the heavens, and in the evening he descended into the west, where he passed into the hidden world below the horizon, the realm of the dead and the sleeping, through which he journeyed all night long before rising once again, renewed at dawn. This was not a poetic flourish laid over some drier truth. It was, for them, the truth. The sun sailed, the gods sailed, and the king, who was himself divine, who was the living image of the sun upon the earth, would need to sail as well when his time on the throne was ended and he departed to take his place among the imperishable stars. To grasp why a ship should matter so much to a dead king, it helps to enter more fully into this vision of the heavens as a great water upon which the sun made its daily crossing. In the Egyptian imagination, the sun god travelled the sky in a sacred vessel, a bark that bore him from the eastern horizon at dawn, up and across the vault of the day, to the western horizon at evening, where he passed out of the world of the living. But the setting of the sun was not an ending, for the Egyptians believed that when the sun sank in the west, it entered a hidden realm beneath the world, a dark and dangerous country of the dead through which it had to journey all through the hours of the night before it could rise again in the east. This nightly passage was imagined as a voyage through 12 hours of darkness, each hour a region with its own gates and its own guardians, and through all of them the sun god sailed in his night bark, carrying with him the hope of the dead who wished to travel in his company. It was a perilous journey, threatened above all by a great serpent of chaos that lay in wait to swallow the sun and to halt the turning of the world, and each night this enemy had to be driven back so that the dawn might come. When the sun rose again at last in the morning, renewed and triumphant, it was as though the whole world had been reborn, and the victory of light over darkness had been won once more, as it had been won every night since the beginning of time. Into this vast cosmic drama the dead king hoped to be woven. To die, for a pharaoh, was not to vanish but to depart upon a journey, to leave the throne of the living world and to join the eternal cycle of the sun and the stars. In some visions of the afterlife the king would sail with the sun god himself, taking his place in the sacred bark and crossing the heavens forever in that divine company. In others he would rise to become one of the imperishable stars, those stars in the northern sky that never set below the horizon but circle endlessly through the night, and which the Egyptians saw as the eternal dead, the blessed ones who had escaped the reach of death entirely. Either way, the king's destiny lay in the sky, upon the water of the heavens, and to reach it he would need the means of travel that any voyage requires, which is to say, a boat. A ship, therefore, was not an ornament of the royal burial, but very nearly a necessity of it, a vessel provided so that the king might make the crossing that waited him, and might not be left stranded on the near shore of death, unable to join the great voyage of the sun. There was, alongside the vision of sailing with the sun, another and older image of the royal afterlife that turned the king's gaze not to the horizon, but to the far north of the night sky, and it too was bound up with the idea of an eternal and unfailing motion. When the Egyptians looked up on a clear night, they saw that most of the stars rose in the east and set in the west, wheeling across the heavens and sinking below the earth in their turn, as the sun did, so that they seemed to share in the great cycle of dying and rising that governed all things. But there was a region of the sky, in the far north, where certain stars never set at all, but circled endlessly about a fixed point, wheeling round and round through the whole of the night without ever dipping below the horizon. These the Egyptians called, in the beautiful phrase that has come down to us, the imperishable ones, the stars that do not know destruction, and they saw in them an image of a life beyond the reach of death, a company of the blessed who had escaped the common fate and been fixed forever in the untiring dance of the northern sky. To join that company was one of the things a dead king might hope for, to be raised up and set among the imperishable stars, circling forever in the deathless quarter of the heavens, and there is a suggestion of this hope in the very architecture of the pyramids and their tombs. Within the Great Pyramid there are narrow passages that run from the burial chambers outward toward the faces of the monument, and it has long been thought by many who study these things that some of these were aligned, whether in fact or in intention, upon significant points of the sky, upon the place where certain stars crossed the meridian, or upon that northern region where the imperishable ones kept their eternal round. Whether every such alignment was truly meant, and exactly which stars were in the builders' minds, are questions on which those who study the matter do not entirely agree, and it is wise to hold the details lightly, for the sky has shifted a little across the intervening ages, and the certainty we might wish for is not to be had. But the general truth seems clear enough, that the Egyptians looked to the stars as well as to the sun in imagining the fate of their kings, and that the monuments were built with the heavens in mind, oriented with great care upon the cardinal directions and reaching, in their very shape and setting, toward the sky. In this vision, the king who died did not simply cease, nor did he merely linger as a shade in some dim underworld, but ascended, rose up out of the world of the living to take his place among the enduring lights of heaven, whether sailing with the sun across the day and through the 12 hours of the night, or fixed among the imperishable stars in the deathless north, or both together, for the Egyptians were not troubled by holding several images of the afterlife at once, and did not demand of their beliefs the kind of single tidy consistency that a later age might expect. What all these images shared was the conviction that the king's destiny lay upward and outward, in the sky, upon or among the eternal motions of the heavens, and that to reach it he would need the means of travel, the boat to carry him across the celestial water, the ascent to lift him to the stars. The ship in its pit belonged to this whole great scheme of hope, one instrument among several by which the dead king was to be sped upon his journey from the world of the living to the deathless company above. And there is something in this ancient looking upward that speaks quietly across the ages to anyone who has stood beneath a clear night sky and felt the slow wheeling of the stars. The Egyptians watched the same northern lights turning about their fixed point that we can watch still, and they built into that turning their deepest hopes for what might lie beyond the end of life, imagining an eternity of gentle, unfailing motion, a circling without end in the quiet reaches of the sky. The buried ship was made for a passage toward that eternity, a vessel for a voyage across water no eye could see, toward a shore among the imperishable stars, and though we cannot share the particular beliefs of the people who made it, we can feel, perhaps, the longing that lay behind them, the wish that the light of a life might not simply go out but be carried onward, somewhere, into a lasting and untroubled peace. The Egyptians held too that a person was made of more than a single simple soul, and that the parts of the self had different needs and different journeys after death. There was the life force that animated the living body, which had to be sustained even in the tomb by offerings of food and drink, and there was another aspect of the self, often pictured as a bird, that could leave the tomb and move freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead, returning to the body at night. For all of these to survive and to flourish beyond death required an immense provision, a whole apparatus of tomb and temple and offering and ritual, and the ship was one part of that provision, the part that answered to the need for travel, for movement, for the crossing of the Great Divide. To bury a boat beside a king was, in this light, simply to give him what he would need, as one might provision any traveller setting out upon a long and uncertain road. It should be said, in fairness to the record, that the fullest written expressions of these beliefs about the sun's voyage and the king's journey through the sky come to us from a time a little after Khufu's own, from sacred texts carved upon the walls of pyramids built by later kings of the Old Kingdom, the earliest large body of religious writing to survive from ancient Egypt. We cannot simply assume that every detail of the vision recorded in those later texts was held in exactly the same form in Khufu's day, but the core of the belief, the sun that sails, the king who joins the eternal voyage, the deep and ancient importance of the boat, plainly reaches back well before those texts were written down, for the boat pits beside Khufu's pyramid are themselves among the oldest and clearest signs that the Egyptians of his age already thought of the royal afterlife in terms of ships and sailing. The buried ship is, in a sense, the belief made solid, a piece of theology rendered in cedar and rope, and it stands as evidence of what the people of that distant time hoped and imagined about the fate that awaited their divine king beyond the shore of death. The word that later writers attached to the buried ship, the solar bark, comes from this belief. A bark is simply a boat, but a bark of the sun is the vessel in which the sun god crosses the sky, and by extension the vessel in which the dead king hopes to join that eternal crossing. There were thought to be two such boats, in fact, one for the day and one for the night, one for the eastward voyage across the heavens, and one for the westward passage through the underworld. And it may be no accident that beside the Great Pyramid the builders prepared more than one boat pit, as though to provide the king with the full complement of vessels his journey through eternity might require. Whether the ship that survives was meant specifically as a day bark or a night bark, or as something else entirely, is one of the many questions that the ship itself cannot answer, and that the surviving records do not settle. The Egyptians who buried it left no plaque explaining their intentions. They left only the ship and the silence, and the pit sealed over with stone. The practice of burying boats beside the tombs of kings did not begin with Khufu, and it is worth pausing to recognise that the buried ship at Giza belongs to a tradition already ancient in his time, one whose roots reach back into the earliest centuries of Egyptian kingship. Long before the pyramids of Giza were built, at a sacred and very old burial ground far to the south, the first kings of a united Egypt had been laid to rest, and near their tombs, archaeologists in more recent times have uncovered the remains of a whole fleet of boats, buried in a long row in graves cut into the desert, each one encased in a shell of mud brick. These vessels are far older even than the ship of Khufu, dating back to the very dawn of Egyptian history, and though they are far less well preserved, reduced to the ghostly impressions and fragile remains of wooden hulls, they show that the idea of providing a dead king with boats for his eternal journey was established at the very beginning and was carried down through the centuries into the great age of the pyramids. When the builders of Khufu prepared the boat pits at Giza, they were not inventing something new but continuing something old, honouring a custom that stretched back to the founders of their civilization. At Giza itself, the ship we are following was not alone. Around the base of the Great Pyramid, the builders cut not one boat pit but several, a group of long rock-cut trenches arranged near the monument, of which the pit containing the surviving ship was only one. Some of these pits were shaped like boats, carved into the rough outline of a vessel, and were found empty, containing no ship at all, so that we cannot always be certain whether they once held boats that have since vanished, or whether they were meant to serve their purpose symbolically, as boat-shaped spaces that stood in for the real thing. Others, like the pit of the surviving ship and its near neighbour, were rectangular trenches roofed with great blocks of stone, and these were the ones that held the dismantled timbers of actual vessels. The full number and arrangement of these pits, and the question of which once held ships and which did not, is a matter that scholars have studied closely, and the picture is not entirely simple, for the passage of thousands of years has left some of the evidence uncertain, but the general truth is clear enough. The Great Pyramid was provided with more than one boat, and with more than one boat pit, as part of a considered scheme to furnish the king with the vessels his journey through eternity might require, and the surviving ship is the most complete and the most marvellous of these, the one that escaped destruction and came down to us whole. This wider setting matters, because it guards us against thinking of the buried ship as a strange or isolated whim. It was nothing of the kind. It was a deeply traditional act, rooted in beliefs and customs already old when it was carried out, and repeated in one form or another across a long span of Egyptian history. Kings before Khufu had been given boats for their tombs, and kings after him would be too, and the ship at Giza stands within that long line as its finest surviving example, the one instance in which the accidents of preservation have allowed us to recover, almost whole, a vessel that would otherwise have been known to us only from empty pits, faint impressions and scattered fragments. To understand it truly is to see it not as a single wonder, but as the one surviving jewel of a whole vanished tradition, the last full ship of a fleet that once was meant to carry the kings of Egypt across the waters of the sky. There is another possibility, and it deserves to be spoken of with the same care, for the record does not allow us to choose between them with any confidence. Some who have studied the ship believe that it was not purely symbolic at all, not a vessel built only for the imagined voyage of the soul, but a real, working boat that had already served a solemn earthly purpose before it was laid to rest. In this reading, the ship was a funeral barge, the very vessel that had carried the body of the dead king across the water, perhaps in the great procession that brought him from his palace or his city to the place of his burial at Giza. Once that final voyage was complete, the ship, having touched the sacred cargo of the king himself, would have become too holy for any ordinary use, and so it was dismantled and buried beside him, to remain with him forever. Those who hold this view point to certain marks and traces upon the timbers, small signs that might suggest the wood had once been wet, that ropes had once been drawn tight under strain, that the ship had known, however briefly, the pressure of real water beneath its hull. Others are not persuaded, and argue that the ship shows no clear proof of ever having floated, that the marks can be explained in other ways, and that the vessel was most likely built purely for burial, a magnificent model at full scale, intended for use only in the world beyond. The honest answer is that we do not know. The sources are silent, the evidence is open to more than one reading, and reasonable scholars have looked at the same timbers and reached different conclusions. This is worth pausing on, because it tells us something true about how the distant past comes down to us. We would like the past to give us clean answers, to tell us plainly what it meant and why it did what it did, but more often it hands us an object of extraordinary beauty and workmanship, sets it before us in silence, and leaves us to argue gently among ourselves about its purpose. The ship of Khufu is such an object. Whatever its exact intended use, its deeper meaning is not really in doubt. It was built to carry a king across the boundary between one world and the next, and to keep him company on a voyage from which no traveller returns. And so, with that purpose in mind, whether earthly or heavenly or both at once, the work of building began, It is here that we can begin to imagine the shipyard, though we must imagine it carefully, for the Egyptians did not leave us a detailed account of how this particular vessel was made, and much of what we can say comes from the ship itself. Read backward like a set of instructions recovered from the finished object, and from the wider knowledge we have of how the boat builders of that age worked. What we can say with confidence is that the ship was not a quick or careless thing. It was made from the finest materials the kingdom could obtain, by craftsmen who stood at the end of a tradition of boat building already thousands of years old, and it was made to a standard that suggests it was always meant to endure, whether in this world or the next. The wood tells the first part of the story, and it tells it plainly, for the main timbers of the ship were cut not from any tree that grew in Egypt, but from the cedar of Lebanon, that tall and fragrant and slow-growing tree that clothed the mountains along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, far to the north of the Nile Delta. Egypt was a land of extraordinary wealth in many things, in grain and gold and stone and skilled hands, but in one thing it was poor, and that thing was timber. The trees that grew along the river and in the oases were mostly small, crooked, or soft, useful for many purposes but not well suited to the long, straight, strong planks that a great ship requires, and so from very early times the Egyptians looked northward across the sea to the coast of what we now call Lebanon, and above all to the port city of Byblos, with which they maintained a trade so old and so steady that the relationship became almost a partnership. From Byblos came the cedar, felled in the mountains and hauled down to the shore and loaded onto ships and carried south across the water to the mouths of the Nile, and from there up the river to the workshops of the king. To bring such timber to Giza was itself a considerable undertaking, and the presence of so much cedar in the buried ship is, in its quiet way, a record of the reach of the Egyptian state under Khufu. It speaks of fleets crossing the sea, of agreements with distant rulers, of the felling of great trees on foreign hillsides, of the smell of fresh-cut cedar drifting across a harbour far away, all of it organised and paid for and carried through so that a king might have his ship. The Egyptians prized cedar not only for its strength and its straightness, but for its fragrance and its resistance to decay, qualities that made it precious for coffins and sacred objects as well as for ships, and qualities that would, in this case, help the buried vessel endure across the millennia in a way that a lesser wood might not have managed. Alongside the cedar, the builders used other woods for particular parts, harder native timbers for the small pegs and fastenings, and for certain fittings where a tougher material was wanted, so that the finished ship was not made from a single kind of wood, but from a considered combination, each timber chosen for the task it had to do. The trade that brought this cedar to Egypt was old, and it was important enough that the Egyptians themselves recorded it among the notable events of their kings' reigns. Upon an ancient stone that preserves a list of the doings of the early rulers of Egypt, year by year, there survives a famous entry describing the arrival of a fleet of ships laden with cedar in the reign of a king of this very era, a plain and matter-of-fact notice set down among the harvests and the festivals and the building of temples, of many vessels bringing the precious timber home from the north. It is a small thing, a few words carved in stone, and yet it opens a window onto a whole world of activity, of ships crossing the eastern sea in numbers, of timber gathered and loaded and carried across the water to the mouths of the Nile, and it shows that the import of cedar was reckoned a matter of importance to the state, worthy to be remembered alongside the great events of a reign. The ship of Khufu, built of that same cedar, is the physical survivor of exactly this trade. The timber of the northern mountains made solid and lasting in a form we can still see and touch today. The port through which most of this timber passed lay upon the coast to the northeast of Egypt, a city whose name became almost a byword for the cedar trade and for the long connection between Egypt and the peoples of that coast. Through this port the Egyptians reached out to the forests of the mountains behind it, and from it they carried away not only cedar but other goods of the region, in an exchange that ran for many centuries and that made the two lands, in a sense, partners in a long commerce. To sail there and back was a real sea voyage, out from the sheltered mouths of the Nile onto the open water of the Mediterranean, along the coast to the northern port, and home again heavy laden, and it required ships capable of the crossing and sailors willing to make it. The Egyptians, for all that they were above all a river people, built and manned such ships and kept the sea road to the Cedar Coast open across the generations, and it is one of the quiet marvels of the buried ship that its very timbers are a record of that maritime reach, cut from trees that grew on foreign hills and carried across foreign water to serve an Egyptian king. We should pause too on what the choice of cedar tells us about the ambitions bound up in the ship. The Egyptians could have built a vessel for burial out of humbler native woods, and for many purposes they did use such woods, piecing together their everyday craft from the modest timber that grew along the river. That the ship of Khufu was built instead of imported cedar, the finest and most costly timber available to them, obtained at real effort and expense from across the sea, marks it out as an object of the highest importance, fit for a king and for the sacred purpose it was meant to serve. The wood itself is a statement, a declaration in cedar that this was no ordinary boat but a vessel worthy of a god upon the earth, made from the best that the whole reach of the kingdom's trade could bring. And there is a further gift in that choice, for it was in part the qualities of the cedar, its density and its fragrance and its resistance to rot, that allowed the ship to survive its long burial so nearly whole, so that the very extravagance of the king's builders, reaching across the sea for the finest timber, became, thousands of years later, the reason we are able to look upon their work at all. The men who shaped that timber into a ship were heirs to one of the oldest boat-building traditions on Earth. Long before there were pyramids, before there were kings whose names we know, the people of the Nile had been building boats, first from bundles of papyrus reed lashed tightly together, light craft that could be poled and paddled through the marshes and along the shallows of the river, and later from wood as their skills and their ambitions grew. The reed boat left a deep mark on the Egyptian imagination and on the very shape of their later vessels, for even when they built in timber, they often gave their ships the graceful upward curving lines of a bundle of reeds, the prow and stern rising in slender points, as though the whole hull had been tied together and drawn tight at each end. The buried ship of Khufu carries these lines. Its form remembers the reed boats of a much older Egypt, translated now into cedar and made vast, a memory of the marsh rendered in the finest wood the kingdom could buy. Those first reed boats deserve a moment of their own, for they were the true beginning of Egyptian sailing, and their shape echoes down the whole later history of the country's ships. Along the banks of the Nile there grew in great abundance a tall marsh plant, the papyrus, whose stems, gathered in bundles and bound tightly together, would float upon the water and could be shaped into simple, light, and surprisingly capable craft. From the earliest times, the people of the river had made such boats, poling and paddling them through the shallows and the reed beds, using them to fish and to fowl and to move about the flooded margins of the land. These reed craft were cheap and quick to make and needed no rare timber, and they served the ordinary purposes of river life for the humblest of the people, so that the marshes of Egypt were always dotted with them, little bundles of bound papyrus carrying men through the green world of the wetlands. And because the bundles were drawn together and tied off at each end, the reed boat naturally took on that graceful upward curving form, high and slender at prow and stern, which became so fixed in the Egyptian eye that even their grandest wooden ships built for kings and gods kept the same shape, as though every Egyptian vessel remembered in its lines the humble reed craft from which the whole tradition had grown. Much of what we know about the everyday boats of ancient Egypt comes not from surviving vessels, which are rare in the extreme, but from the images and models that the Egyptians left behind in their tombs. For it was their custom to fill the tombs of the dead with pictures and small replicas of the things of life, so that the dead might have the use of them forever, and among these things boats appear again and again. Upon the painted and carved walls of many tombs, we can still see the ships of Egypt going about their work, under sail and under oar, carrying grain and cattle and mourners and gods, and in some tombs there were placed small wooden models of boats, carefully made, complete with tiny figures of rowers and steersmen and passengers, so that the dead might sail in the next world as they had in this one. These images and models are a precious record, a gallery of ancient ships preserved by the very beliefs that also gave us the buried bark of Khufu, and from them we can learn a great deal about how the boats of Egypt were shaped and rigged and handled, filling out our picture of a maritime world that has otherwise almost entirely vanished. The great ship of Khufu stands at the summit of this tradition, the largest and finest and best preserved of all, but it does not stand alone, and behind it lies a whole crowded river of humbler craft, remembered in paint and in miniature, from which its own graceful form descended. We do not know the names of the shipwrights who built it. The records that survive from that age tell us a great deal about kings and gods, and almost nothing about the hands that did the actual work, the carpenters and the rope makers and the labourers who felled and hauled and lifted, who fitted the planks and drew the lashings tight and smoothed the finished hull. They are anonymous to us, as most of the ancient world's workers are, and yet the ship is their monument as much as the king's. For it is their skill, and no one else's, that made it and that preserved it whole across so many centuries. When we look at the ship today, we are looking at their judgment and their patience made visible, at decisions taken by particular men on particular mornings 4,500 years ago, about how thick a plank should be and where a lashing should pass and how tightly a joint should be drawn. Their names are gone, but their work remains, and in a sense that is a kind of immortality too, quieter than a king's but no less real. We may let ourselves imagine them for a moment, though we must do so honestly, filling in only what the general knowledge of their world allows, and inventing no particular name or deed that the record does not support. There would have been the men who felled the cedars far away in the northern mountains, working among the tall, fragrant trees on the steep hillsides, cutting and trimming the great trunks and dragging them down toward the sea. There would have been the sailors who carried the timber across the water to Egypt, keeping watch upon the open Mediterranean, bringing their laden ships at last into the mouths of the Nile. There would have been the haulers who moved the timber up the river into the workshops, and the carpenters who shaped it, bending over the planks with their tools, judging the grain of the wood, cutting the channels and the slots with a patient exactness. There would have been the rope makers who twisted the fibres into the cords that bound the ship, and the labourers who lifted and held and fitted the great pieces into place, and overseers who directed the whole, and scribes who recorded the materials and the work. All of these, and more, had their part in the making of the ship, and though not one of them is known to us by name, the vessel is the sum of all their labour, the joined achievement of many hands across many trades. There is a particular poignancy in thinking of these anonymous makers, for they lived and worked and died in a world that has vanished utterly, and left behind, in the ship, one of the few clear traces of their skill. They can have had no notion that their work would outlast their civilization, their language, their gods, and everything else they knew, and come down whole into an age they could not have imagined. They meant only to build well, to serve their king, to do the work that was set before them, and yet in doing so, they made a thing that would carry the memory of their craft across an almost unthinkable reach of time, so that we, so far from them, can still see exactly how they cut and joined and bound the timbers, and can still admire the sureness of their hands. The ship is their monument as truly as it is the king's, and perhaps more movingly so, for the king sought immortality deliberately, with all the power of a great state behind him, while the builders won a quieter immortality simply by doing their ordinary work supremely well, and letting it speak for them across the ages. The way they built the ship is one of the most remarkable things about it, and to a modern eye it can seem almost impossible, for the ship of Khufu was held together with scarcely any metal at all, and with no nails driving plank to plank in the manner we might expect. Instead it was, in the old and honourable phrase, a sewn boat, a vessel whose planks were literally stitched together with rope. This was not a crude or makeshift method, but a sophisticated craft with a long history, and it produced a hull that was both strong and in its own way flexible, able to give a little against the pressures of water and weight without breaking. To build in this fashion, the shipwrights first shaped the planks with great care, carving into their edges a series of narrow channels and holes, and then, when the planks were fitted edge to edge, they threaded ropes through these channels and drew them tight, binding the timbers together as a tailor binds two pieces of cloth with thread. The ropes were made from the fibres of plants that grew in Egypt, and when they were wetted they would swell and tighten, drawing the planks ever more firmly together and helping to close the seams against the water. The result was a hull built, as the specialists say, from the outside in, the shell of planks assembled first and then strengthened from within by frames and beams, rather than a skeleton of ribs raised first and then covered over with planking in the manner that would become common in much later ages of shipbuilding. It was a way of working that suited the materials and the traditions of the Nile, and it produced, in the ship of Khufu, a vessel of great elegance and considerable size, one whose construction can still be read plainly in the surviving timbers, every channel and every hole and every rope path preserved, so that those who study it can trace, joint by joint, exactly how the ancient builders meant it all to fit. When the ship was found and slowly reassembled, in a story we shall come to, it was these very channels and holes that guided the work, the ancient builders reaching across thousands of years to show their modern successors how the pieces were meant to go. it is worth dwelling a little longer on the cleverness of this way of building, for it was a method perfectly suited to its materials and its purpose, and once understood, it seems not primitive at all, but elegant and sure. The shipwrights began, as we have said, with the outer shell of the hull, fitting the great planks of cedar edge to edge and drawing them together with their ropes, so that the shape of the vessel was formed first, from the skin inward. To keep the planks from sliding against one another, they cut into the meeting edges small slots, and into these slots they set flat wooden tongues, so that each plank was locked to its neighbour by a row of these hidden wooden keys, a technique of joining timber that was already known to them and that would remain in use, in one form or another, for thousands of years to come. Then, with the planks keyed and lashed into the curving shell of the hull, they strengthened the whole from within, setting frames and crossbeams into place to brace the structure, and to carry the deck, and binding these two into the fabric of the ship, so that the finished vessel was a single unified thing, its outer skin and its inner framing all drawn together by the same patient logic of channel and rope and wooden key. The ropes themselves were the heart of it, and the choice to hold the ship together with rope rather than with metal was not a weakness, but a real advantage, given the materials at hand. When the fibre ropes were threaded through their channels and drawn tight and then wetted, they would swell and shrink against the wood, gripping ever more firmly and, in a vessel that met the water, helping to close the seams between the planks as the timber itself swelled with moisture. A hull bound in this way had a certain give to it, a slight flexibility that let it work gently with the stresses upon it, rather than resisting them rigidly and cracking, and there is a real ingenuity in a structure that gains its strength partly from its willingness to bend. To modern eyes accustomed to ships held together with nails and bolts and welds, a great vessel stitched together with rope can seem almost unbelievable, and yet the ship of Khufu, more than 40 meters of it, was made in just this way, and made so well that its timbers held their shape through 4,500 years in the ground. When at last the ship was studied in the modern age, all of this could be read directly from the surviving pieces, for the channels and the slots and the rope paths were still there in the wood, exactly as the ancient shipwrights had cut them, and by following them the modern investigators could reconstruct not only the shape of the ship, but the very method of its making, the sequence of steps by which plank had been joined to plank and frame set into hull. It was as though the builders had left a set of instructions, not written in words but carved into the timber itself, in the language of joinery, waiting to be read by whoever should one day take the trouble to understand it. And in this way the ship became not merely a beautiful object recovered from the past, but a document, a detailed and reliable record of how the boatwrights of the Old Kingdom actually built a great vessel, a kind of knowledge that from almost any other source would be lost to us entirely. Few ancient crafts can be studied so directly, from the actual hands-on work of the ancient makers, and it is one more of the ship's quiet gifts that it teaches us, so plainly, how it was made. Let us now try to see the ship whole, to move slowly along its length as though walking the length of a quiet quay at dawn, with the finished vessel resting before us, and to take in, deck by deck and part by part, the thing that all this labour produced. It is a long ship, longer than most people expect, stretching more than 40 metres from end to end, which is to say something close to 143 feet, though the exact figure depends a little on how one measures the sweeping curves of prow and stern, and different accounts give slightly different numbers. It is narrow for its length, perhaps 5 or 6 metres across at its widest, so that the overall impression is of a long, slender, graceful shape, low in the middle and rising toward each end into those tall, curving points that recall the reed boats of ancient memory. Its lines are clean and unhurried. There is nothing squat or heavy about it. It sits upon the imagination the way a long feather might sit upon still water, an object of considerable size that nonetheless seems light, poised, almost weightless. Along much of its length the ship would have carried its great oars, long sweeps of cedar with broad blades, ranged along the sides, some for rowing, and some, at the stern, serving as the steering oars by which the vessel would be guided. The number of these oars, and the question of whether they were ever truly meant to be pulled through water by living rowers, or were instead symbolic, provided so that the king might have the means of propulsion in the world beyond, is another of the ship's quiet uncertainties. Some of the oars seem large and unwieldy for practical use, which has led certain scholars to suspect that the ship, whatever it was for, was never intended to be rowed in earnest across any real expanse of water. Others point out that a ceremonial vessel of this importance might well have been fitted with oversized oars precisely to impress, and that we should be careful about reading too much into their proportions. Here again the ship keeps its counsel, and here again the honest course is to describe what survives and to leave the deeper question gently open. Near the middle of the ship, set upon the deck, there stood a cabin, a long, low structure of light framework that would once have been covered over, providing a sheltered space along the central part of the vessel, and toward the front a smaller canopy or booth was raised, of the kind that in Egyptian art often shades an important person seated at the prow. We should imagine these not as heavy wooden houses, but as elegant, tent-like structures, their frames slender, their coverings light, designed to give shade and dignity rather than to withstand storms. The whole effect would have been one of grace and ceremony rather than of rugged seaworthiness, a vessel made to carry a king in state along calm water, or to bear his spirit in stately fashion across the imagined waters of the sky, rather than to battle the open sea. Every detail, from the sweeping ends to the sheltering canopies, speaks of dignity, of a ship meant above all to be beautiful and fitting for the passage of a god upon the earth. If we could walk slowly along the length of the reassembled ship, as visitors have done in the museums that have housed it, we would be struck first by its sheer scale, for it is far larger than the little boats that the word might call to mind. A great long hull that dwarfs the person standing beside it. To stand at its midpoint and look toward either end is to see the deck stretch away and the sides rise gently, and then, at the very ends, to see the timbers curve upward into those tall and slender points, the prow and the stern reaching skyward in the old reed boat manner, so that the whole vessel seems to lift at either extremity as though yearning upward. The finish of the cedar is smooth and fine, the work of careful hands, and the great planks fit together with a precision that speaks of real mastery, so that even now, thousands of years on, the eye follows the long clean lines of the hull with a kind of restful pleasure, feeling the rightness of its proportions. Ranged along the sides would have been the long oars, their looms of cedar and their broad blades reaching down toward the water that the ship, in its earthly form, may never have touched. Whether every one of these was ever meant to be pulled by a living rower, or whether some were provided chiefly for the sake of completeness and dignity, we cannot finally say, but their presence gives the ship the look of a great rowing vessel, a barge propelled by many hands moving in unison. Toward the stern were set the largest oars of all, the great steering sweeps by which the vessel would have been guided, mounted so that a steersman could lean upon them and turn the ship's head this way or that, and these steering oars, broad and long, are among the most impressive of all the ship's fittings. Speaking of a vessel meant to be handled with skill along the water, all along the deck the planking would have made a smooth floor, and upon it stood the light structures we have described, the long central cabin and the smaller canopy toward the bow, their frames slender and their coverings light, giving shade and shelter and marking out the places where a king, living or dead, might be born in dignity. There is something deeply affecting in the completeness of it all, in the way that so many parts survived. Not only the great hull, but the oars, the steering gear, the framework of the cabin, the coils of rope, down to the smallest pegs and fittings, so that the ship comes to us not as a bare skeleton to be imagined into life, but as a nearly whole vessel, wanting only the coverings of its canopies and the hands of its crew. To look upon it is to feel the presence of the people who made it and used it and buried it, to sense the reality of a moment 4,500 years gone, when this very ship, these very timbers, played their part in the great ritual of a king's passage into eternity. Few objects from so distant a past come down to us so complete, and fewer still allow us to stand, as it were, on the deck of the ancient world and to feel, for a moment, the scale and the grace and the seriousness of what its makers achieved. When the ship was complete, whatever use it was put to in the brief span of its life above ground, there came at last the extraordinary decision that would preserve it for us, the decision to take it apart and bury it. This is one of the strangest and most moving aspects of the whole story, and it repays a slow and careful telling, for it was not a hasty act of concealment, but a patient and deliberate work of ordering and packing, carried out by people who clearly understood exactly what they were doing and who meant the ship to remain in some sense ready. They did not simply break the vessel up and cast the pieces into a hole. They dismantled it thoughtfully, timber by timber, plank by plank, untying the lashings and lifting the great oars and separating the parts of the cabin, until the entire ship had been reduced to its components, more than 1,000 of them, and by some careful counts something over 1,200 separate pieces, ranging from the longest planks down to the smallest pegs and fragments of rope. These pieces they then arranged within the pit that had been cut for them into the bedrock at the foot of the pyramid, and here again the care is evident, for the timbers were not thrown in at random but laid down in a considered order, in layers, the longer pieces below and the shorter above, grouped in a way that suggests the builders were keeping track of how the ship went together, almost as though they were leaving instructions for a reassembly they did not expect to see. The oars were laid along the length of the pit, the parts of the cabin were set in their place, the ropes were coiled and stowed, and over the whole arrangement, when it was complete, the workers lowered great blocks of limestone, huge slabs that formed a roof over the pit, and sealed the ship away beneath them, closing the last gap through which the light of the sun could reach the cedar it had helped, in the Egyptian mind, to consecrate. The manner of that sealing has much to tell us, and it repays a closer look. The covering was made of great blocks of fine limestone, many of them laid side by side across the mouth of the pit to form a heavy stone roof, and the joints between them were sealed with plaster, so that the chamber beneath was closed as tightly as the builders could manage. It was this careful sealing, more than anything, that gave the ship its extraordinary preservation, for a pit closed so completely admits almost no air and almost no moisture, and in such stillness the timbers could rest without decay across a span of time that would have destroyed them utterly had they been left exposed. The builders, in sealing the ship so well, cannot have known that they were preserving it for us, thousands of years in their future. They meant only to close it away forever, to make it secure and inviolate for the king's eternal use. But their thoroughness became, long afterward, a gift to the whole world, for a less careful sealing would have let in the slow agents of decay, and left us in the end with only dust and fragments. Upon some of the great covering blocks there were found marks and inscriptions in red, of the kind that workers made upon building stones to guide and record their labour, and among these there appear references that connect the sealing of the pit, or at least the stones that sealed it, with the reign of Khufu's successor rather than with Khufu's own. This is a small detail, but it carries real weight, for it suggests that the ship may have been laid to rest not by Khufu himself, who could hardly bury his own funeral goods, but by those who came after him, and who saw to the completion of his burial, sealing the boat in its pit as one of the final acts of laying the great king to rest. And this in turn lends some support, though it does not amount to proof, to the idea that the ship may have been the very vessel used in Khufu's funeral, the boat that bore his body across the water to Giza, dismantled and buried once its solemn task was done. Here, as so often with this ship, the evidence points gently in a certain direction without ever settling the matter beyond dispute, and the honest reader is left holding a strong possibility rather than a certainty, which is perhaps the most that the deep past will usually allow. Within the pit, the ship had been laid down not in a jumble but in an ordered series of layers, the timbers grouped and stacked one level upon another, so that when the modern excavators came to lift them out, they could record the position of each piece and begin to understand how the whole had been arranged. The great planks and beams lay in the lower levels, and the smaller pieces above, and the oars were laid along the length of the pit, and the parts of the cabin and the coils of rope had their places too, the whole forming a kind of orderly stowage, a ship packed away with method and care rather than merely discarded. There is something touching in this order, in the evident intention that the ship should not be lost or muddled, but kept whole in the sense that all its parts were preserved together, ready to be joined again should the need ever arise. Whether the builders truly imagined a reassembly, or whether the care was simply an expression of reverence for a sacred object, we cannot know, but the effect, across the long reach of time, was to hand down to the modern world not a wreck, but a ship in waiting, complete in all its parts, needing only to be understood and put back together. The sealing was so complete that it created within the pit a kind of stillness that the ship would keep for the whole of its long burial. The heavy limestone roof kept out the light, the rain, the wind, and very nearly the air itself, so that within that closed chamber the conditions changed hardly at all across the passing centuries. It was this, more than anything, that saved the ship. Cedar is a durable and fragrant wood, resistant to rot and unappealing to many of the creatures that would otherwise devour it, and sealed away in the dry, still darkness of its rock-cut pit, it endured in a way that scarcely any organic thing endures, holding its shape, keeping its strength, retaining even, it is said, something of its scent, so that when the pit was finally opened in the modern age, those present spoke of the smell of ancient cedar rising from the ground, a breath of the forests of Lebanon released after 4,500 years, but the opening still lay far in the future. For now the ship was sealed, the workers had gone, and above the buried vessel the Great Pyramid stood in the sun newly finished, while the ship began its long wait in the dark. And yet, quiet as that darkness was, the story of the world's great ships did not end at the edge of that pit. It stretched away before and after in a long line, and it is worth stepping back for a moment to see where the ship of Khufu stands within it. For the human effort to build great ships upon the water is very old and very persistent, and it did not begin or end with Egypt. Long before the ship of Khufu was laid in its pit, people all around the ancient world had been learning to cross water in ever larger and more capable craft, from the simple rafts and dugout canoes of the earliest times to the reed boats of the great river valleys and the plank-built vessels that followed them. The Nile itself was a highway of ships, crowded with craft of every size, from the little papyrus skiffs of fishermen and fowlers to the broad barges that carried the enormous stones for the pyramids and temples down the river from the quarries, floated on the flood to the very edge of the building sites. To move a single block of granite weighing many tons from the quarries of the south to the monuments of the north required ships of real capacity and real strength, and the Egyptians built them and used them and depicted them upon the walls of their tombs, so that we can still see, in painted scenes thousands of years old, the barges of Egypt moving under sail and oar along the great river. Beyond the river lay the sea, and here too the Egyptians ventured, though with more caution, for they were never a seafaring people in the way that some of their neighbours and successors would become. Still, they sailed. Their ships crossed to Byblos for the cedar, as we have seen, and in later reigns, though after the time of Khufu, they mounted grand expeditions far down the coast of the Red Sea to a distant land they called Punt, a place of incense and gold and exotic goods, and they recorded these voyages upon the walls of their temples with evident pride, showing the ships being loaded with the treasures of the south for the long journey home. The building of a ship able to make such a voyage, and to return, was among the great technical achievements of the age, and it placed Egypt within a much wider ancient world of seafarers, of Cretans and Phoenicians and many others, all of them bending timber and rope and sail toward the common human wish to cross the water and to carry more and to go further than had been possible before. In later ages, the Egyptians themselves mounted voyages that they were proud enough to carve upon the walls of their temples, and among the most famous of these was a great expedition, sent out long after the time of Khufu by a ruler of a much later dynasty, down the coast of the Red Sea to that distant land of incense and gold that they called Punt. The temple carvings that record this voyage show the ships being laden with the treasures of the far south, with fragrant trees carried in baskets and heaps of precious goods borne aboard for the long journey home, and they give us a vivid picture of Egyptian seafaring at its height, of vessels sturdy enough to make a real ocean passage and to bring back their cargo across hundreds of miles of open water. That such a voyage was thought worthy of so grand a memorial tells us how great an achievement it was reckoned, and it reminds us that the Egyptians, river people though they were at heart, could and did venture upon the sea when the ambitions of their kings required it. Beyond Egypt, and in ages long after Khufu, the human contest to build ever larger ships continued, and produced vessels beside which even the great bark of Giza would seem modest in size. The peoples of the classical Mediterranean, the Greeks, and later the Romans, built ships of astonishing scale, war galleys driven by many banks of oars and manned by hundreds of rowers, huge merchant vessels that carried grain across the sea to feed great cities, and now and then ships of almost extravagant magnificence built more for display than for use. There are accounts, from that later world, of enormous pleasure ships and of vessels of such size that harbours could scarcely hold them, floating palaces adorned with gardens and halls, built by wealthy rulers to proclaim their power upon the water. Some of these later giants were far longer and far heavier than the ship of Khufu, and represented the outer limits of what could be achieved with the timber and the techniques of their day. The long human ambition to build the largest ship to outdo all rivals in scale and splendour ran on through the centuries, one vessel surpassing another in a contest that would continue, in one form or another, right down to our own age of iron and steel. And yet, set against all these later and greater ships, the bark of Khufu keeps a distinction that none of them can match, and it is not a distinction of size. For of nearly all those countless ancient vessels, the war galleys and the grain carriers and the floating palaces alike, almost nothing survives. They were built of wood, and wood, in the end, does not last, and the sea and the shore between them have swallowed the ships of the ancient world almost without trace. Here and there a wreck is found upon the sea floor, its timbers half preserved in the mud, its cargo scattered about it, and from such rare finds the patient work of underwater archaeology has recovered precious knowledge of how the ancients built and sailed and traded. But a whole ship preserved entire, every timber intact, is a thing of the greatest rarity, and among the very oldest of large vessels it is rarest of all. This is why the ship of Khufu matters as it does. It is not the largest ancient ship, nor the most seaworthy, nor the most famous in its own day. It is the one that survived, so old and so nearly whole, when almost all the others vanished, and in surviving it became a window, clear and direct, into a moment of the human story that would otherwise be lost to us behind an impenetrable darkness. Seen against this long background, the ship of Khufu occupies a curious and special place. It is not the largest ship the ancient world would ever build, not by a great margin, for later ages would raise enormous vessels, war galleys of many banks of oars, immense grain carriers, and pleasure ships of almost absurd magnificence, some of them far larger than the buried bark of Giza. Nor is it, in the strict sense, the most seaworthy, for it was in all likelihood a ceremonial vessel of calm water, rather than a ship built to face the storms of the open sea. What makes it extraordinary is something else entirely. It is its age, and above all its completeness. Of all the countless ships built in the ancient world, across thousands of years, the overwhelming majority are gone utterly, rotted away in the water or on the shore, broken up for their timber, burned or lost beneath the waves and reduced to scattered fragments. To find any ancient ship at all is rare. To find one so old and so nearly whole, every timber preserved, is close to a miracle of survival, and it is this, more than its size, that gives the ship of Khufu its unique place in the long story of shipbuilding. It is a window, almost perfectly clear, into a moment of that story that is otherwise almost entirely dark. And so, with the ship sealed in its pit and the wider world of great ships sketched around it, the long centuries began to pass. It is difficult, and perhaps impossible, truly to feel the weight of the time that the ship spent buried, for it is a span so vast that the mind slides off it and reaches instead for comparisons. Consider only this. When the ship was laid in the ground, the pyramid above it was brand new, its casing bright, its edges sharp. By the time the great pharaohs whose names are most famous to us today had come and gone, the ship had already lain buried for 1,000 years and more. By the time the temples of classical Greece were raised, the ship had lain in the dark for very nearly 2,000 years. By the time the armies of Rome marched across the ancient world, it had waited for well over 2,000 years, and still it lay undisturbed, its cedar timbers holding their shape in the sealed and silent pit, while, high above, the desert wind wore slowly at the pyramid, and the world turned over and over again into shapes the builders of the ship could never have imagined. It is worth resting for a while in the sheer quietness of those buried centuries, for there is a strange peace in the thought of the ship lying so still while the world above it moved through all its restless changes. Season followed season upon the plateau, the flood rising and spreading and withdrawing year upon year, the fields greening and yellowing and being cut, the sun crossing the sky each day, and the imperishable stars wheeling each night about their fixed point in the north, and through all of it the ship lay unmoving in its sealed pit, untouched by the turning of the seasons, keeping its own single moment intact within the flow of time. Above it the moon rose and set and rose again 10,000 times and 10,000 more, silvering the flank of the pyramid and the drifted sand, and the ship neither knew nor needed the light, resting in a darkness that never changed, a stillness that no night and no day could reach. There is something in that image that soothes the restless mind, the thought of a thing so perfectly at rest, so far beyond the reach of hurry or alarm, lying quiet through the long procession of the ages with nothing asked of it and nothing to disturb it, Generations of people were born and grew and laboured and died in the villages along the river, within sight of the pyramid, never dreaming of the ship beneath the stones. Children played in the shadow of the great monument and grew old and were themselves laid in the earth, and their children after them, and their children's children, in an unbroken succession of ordinary lives lived out above the sleeping vessel, none of them the wiser. The language they spoke slowly changed, and then changed again, until the tongue of Khufu's builders would have been strange to the people who dwelt above his ship, and then that later tongue changed too, and gave way at last to others entirely, so that many different ways of speaking passed across the land while the ship lay silent beneath them all. Empires sent their armies along the valley, and the banners of distant kings were raised over the old land, and new gods were worshipped where the old ones had been. And still the ship kept its place in its silence, indifferent to all of it, an island of one ancient morning preserved beneath the shifting surface of the years. To think upon this is not to feel the sadness that so often attends the passing of time, the ache of things lost and gone, but rather a curious calm, for the ship was not lost, only waiting. And all the while that the centuries were pouring over it, the vessel was quietly keeping faith, holding its shape and its meaning safe in the dark until the far-off day when it would be found. There is a consolation in that, in the thought that something can endure so completely, so patiently through so much, and come at last unharmed into the light. The ship asks us to slow our sense of time, to measure it not in the quick, anxious span of a single life, but in the long, slow, untroubled reach of the ages, and to find in that vast and quiet perspective a kind of rest. Beneath the stones, through all the turning years, the ship simply was, and waited, and kept its ancient peace, and there is no gentler image of endurance in all the long record of the things that human hands have made. To dwell on this is to feel something of the true depth of the past, a depth that our ordinary sense of history can scarcely reach. We're used to thinking of the ancient Egyptians as belonging to a single distant age, all of them somehow near to one another in the far mists of time, but the Egypt of Khufu was already unimaginably old to the later Egyptians, whom we also call ancient. When the boy king, whose golden tomb so captivates the modern world, was laid to rest, the ship of Khufu had already been buried for more than 1,000 years, and the pyramid above it was to that later Egyptian as remote and venerable as the oldest ruins of antiquity are to us. When the last of the native pharaohs gave way to foreign rulers, and Egypt passed under the sway of Greek kings and then of Roman emperors, the ship had lain in the dark for well over 2,000 years, and the very language and religion of the people who had made it were fading toward extinction, their old gods giving way to new ones, their ancient script becoming a mystery that no one could any longer read. Through all of these changes, the ship simply endured, unmoved and unknowing, an unbroken thread of one single ancient moment carried across the whole tapestry of later history. And still, the wait went on. The empires of the classical world rose and fell in their turn. New faiths spread across the land of the Nile, and new peoples and new rulers, each generation living out its span above the buried ship without the faintest knowledge that it lay there. Travellers came from far away to gaze upon the pyramids and to wonder at them, and scholars measured them, and treasure-seekers dug into them, and poets wrote of them as symbols of the vanity or the greatness of human ambition. And through it all, the ship kept its secret beneath the great blocks along the pyramid's southern flank. The desert sand drifted and gathered and buried the lower courses of the monuments. The fine white casing that had once made the pyramid gleam was stripped away, stone by stone, to build the walls and mosques and houses of later cities, until the Great Pyramid stood rough and bare against the sky. Whole civilizations came and went in the valley of the Nile, and the ship, sealed in its perfect stillness, took no part in any of it, waiting with a patience beyond all human patience for a day of uncovering that no one living could foresee. It is almost beyond the power of the mind to hold such a span of waiting, and yet the ship held it, plank and rope and cedar keeping faith across the ages, until at last, in a century that its makers could never have dreamed of, the hands that would wake it drew near. For a great part of that long burial, the world above the ship had lost even the power to read the writing of the people who had made it, and this too is part of the story, for the ship waited not only through the fall of Egypt's ancient greatness, but through a long age in which the very language of its builders had become an impenetrable mystery. There came a time, many centuries after Khufu, when the old script of Egypt, those beautiful carved signs that covered the temples and the tombs, ceased to be understood by anyone at all. The knowledge of how to read them faded and was lost. The last people who could interpret them died, and for many hundreds of years the inscriptions that covered the monuments of Egypt stood mute, gazed upon by travellers and scholars who could make nothing of them, a wall of silent pictures guarding a meaning that no one living could unlock. The whole vast record of ancient Egypt, its histories and its prayers and its accounts, lay sealed behind that lost script as surely as the ship lay sealed beneath its stones, present to the eye but closed to the understanding, a treasure that could be seen but not read. Then, in the age when the modern study of the ancient world was being born, the key was at last recovered in one of the great intellectual achievements of that time. A stone was found bearing the same text carved in more than one script, among them the old Egyptian signs and a later and better understood writing, and by the patient labour of scholars comparing the one with the other, the meaning of the ancient signs was slowly teased out, until at length the lost script gave up its secret and could be read once more. It is difficult to overstate what this recovery meant, for with it the whole silent world of ancient Egypt began to speak again, the inscriptions upon the monuments yielding up their sense, the names of kings and gods emerging from the long darkness, the histories and the beliefs of that distant civilization becoming, for the first time in many centuries, legible to human eyes. The land that had been a place of mute and mysterious ruins became a place whose ancient voices could be heard again, and the modern science of studying it, of digging and recording and interpreting, grew up around that new ability to read. It was into a world newly able to understand ancient Egypt then that the ship would in time be uncovered, and this matters greatly, for had the vessel been found in the long age when the old script was still unreadable, much of what makes it precious to us would have been lost. Because the writing had been recovered, the red workman's marks upon the covering stones could be read and connected with a particular reign. Because the histories had been pieced together, the ship could be set in its place within the known sequence of kings and dynasties. Because the beliefs of the Egyptians about the sun and the sky and the royal afterlife had been recovered from their own writings, the purpose of the buried boat could be understood, at least in part, rather than remaining a total enigma. The recovery of the lost language was, in a sense, the necessary preparation for the recovery of the ship, the one making the other meaningful, so that when the vessel at last came up out of its pit, it emerged not into a world that could only wonder at it blankly, but into a world equipped to read its story, to place it in time, and to grasp something of what its makers had intended. The long silence of the script and the long silence of the ship ended, as it happened, within the same great age of rediscovery, and it is fitting that they did, for the two silences belong together, and the breaking of the one made possible the true understanding of the other. Through all of this the ship simply waited. It knew nothing of the rise and fall of the dynasties that followed Khufu, nothing of the invaders and the pharaohs and the priests who came after, nothing of the slow decline of the old religion, or the coming of new faiths and new rulers and new languages to the valley of the Nile. It did not feel the passing of the ages of bronze and iron, the wars and the peaces, the cities founded and abandoned, the whole enormous procession of human history moving across the surface of the world above it. Sealed in its stillness, it was untouched by any of it, an island of one ancient moment preserved intact within the flow of time, holding within itself the craft and the belief of the old kingdom of Egypt as though under a spell. Empires that did not yet exist when the ship was buried would rise, dominate the world and crumble into ruin, all while the ship lay quietly in the dark, and the hardest part of its long story in a sense was simply this immense and patient endurance, the keeping of its shape and its meaning across a stretch of time that the human mind can name but can scarcely truly hold. Above the pit, the site itself changed and changed again. The pyramid, once the beating heart of a living cult, tended by priests and supplied with offerings, gradually lost its guardians as the centuries wore on and the old order faded. The temples that had stood beside it fell into ruin and were robbed of their fine stone for other buildings. The casing that had once made the pyramid gleam was stripped away over long ages, carried off to build the walls and mosques of later cities, until the great monument stood bare and weathered, the rough coarse stones exposed to the sun. Sand drifted across the plateau, burying the lower courses of the monuments and softening the ancient contours of the site. Travellers came from distant lands to marvel at the pyramids and to wonder who had built them and how, and scholars measured them and argued about them, and treasure hunters tunnelled into them in search of gold. And through all of this comings and goings, No one knew that beneath a line of great limestone blocks along the southern flank of the greatest pyramid, there lay, sealed and perfect, one of the oldest ships in the world. The blocks were there to be seen, but they gave no sign of what they hid. The ship kept its secret, and the world walked past it for age after age after age. The world walked past it, in fact, into the modern era, past the coming of scholars with their instruments and their careful surveys, past the great age of exploration and excavation, when so many of Egypt's buried wonders were brought to light, past the opening of tomb after tomb, and the deciphering of the ancient script and the slow reconstruction of the lost history of the Nile. Even as archaeology matured into a careful science, even as the plateau of Giza was mapped and studied and dug over in great detail, the ship remained hidden, its pit unsuspected beneath the blocks and the debris, until at last, in the middle of the 20th century, in the year that we would write as 1954, its long wait came quietly to an end. The manner of its finding was, fittingly for so patient an object, not a matter of violent excavation or triumphant treasure hunting, but of careful, almost routine work, of an attentive eye noticing something that others had passed over, and of a decision to look closer where looking closer was not obviously required. The man whose name is joined forever to the discovery was an Egyptian archaeologist named Kamel el-Malak, who was engaged in clearing away rubble and sand from the southern side of the Great Pyramid, work of the ordinary, patient sort that fills so much of an archaeologist's life. As the debris was removed along the base of the pyramid, there came into view a line of great limestone blocks, set edge to edge, forming what was plainly a deliberate covering over something in the rock beneath. Such things had been noted before in a general way, but the significance of this particular line of blocks had not been grasped. El-Malak, studying them, came to suspect that they sealed a pit, and that the pit might contain something of importance, and rather than assume that it had already been robbed or was empty, as might easily have been supposed after so many thousands of years, he pressed on with the slow and careful work of investigating what lay below. The blocks were massive, and shifting even one of them was a considerable labour, but at length a way was made to see into the sealed space beneath, and what happened next has become one of the quiet legends of Egyptian archaeology. The circumstances of the finding are worth telling with some care, for they show how often the great discoveries come not from luck alone but from patient attention, and a willingness to look where others have not. The work that led to the ship was, in its outward form, unglamorous, the clearing away of accumulated sand and rubble from along the base of the pyramid, part of the ordinary business of tidying and studying a much-visited site. As the debris was removed, the line of great limestone blocks came to light, set carefully in place, and the archaeologist studying them was not content to note them and pass on. He reasoned that so deliberate a covering must seal something beneath, and rather than assume, as might easily have been assumed, that any such pit had long ago been robbed or had never held anything of note, he pressed on to discover what lay below. This persistence, this refusal to take the easy assumption, was the seed of the whole discovery, and it is a reminder that even at a site as famous and as thoroughly explored as Giza, a patient eye could still find, after all the centuries, something wholly new and wholly astonishing. When at last a small hole was made through the ceiling stone, the space beneath was black and unknowable, and to see into it required light. It is said that a mirror was used to catch the sunlight, and to cast a beam down into the darkness of the pit, so that the first glimpse of what lay within came as a shaft of reflected daylight, falling upon timbers that had not felt the sun for 4,500 years. Whether or not every detail of the story is exactly as it has been told, the essential moment is real enough, and it is a moment worth pausing upon, the instant when a beam of light first reached down into that sealed and ancient darkness, and revealed dimly the shapes of the buried ship. All the long waiting of the centuries came, in that instant, to its end. The seal was broken, the darkness was pierced, and the ship that had lain hidden since the age of the pyramid builders began, at last, to return to the world of the living. For when at last a small opening was made through the covering, and the sealed darkness of the pit was breached for the first time in 4,500 years, those present did not at first see the ship, for the space was dark and the timbers lay below. What they noticed first, so the accounts relate, was a smell. Up out of the pit, released from its long confinement, rose the scent of ancient cedar, the fragrance of the wood that had come so long ago from the mountains of Lebanon, preserved along with the timbers themselves in the sealed and airless dark. To breathe in that smell was to breathe air that had in a sense been shut away since the days of the pyramid builders, and it is not hard to imagine the hush that must have fallen over those who caught that first breath of the ancient forest rising from the ground. Then, as light was brought to bear and eyes adjusted to the depths, the timbers themselves came into view, the long planks and the great oars and the coiled ropes all lying in their ordered layers exactly as they had been placed so unimaginably long before, and it became clear that what had been found was not a scattering of broken pieces but a whole ship, dismantled and stored, waiting in the dark to be made whole again. The finding of the ship was only the beginning of a task that would prove far longer and far more delicate than the discovery itself. For a ship broken down into more than 1,000 pieces and buried for 4,500 years does not simply spring back into shape once it is uncovered. The timbers, though astonishingly well preserved, were ancient and fragile, and they had to be lifted from the pit with immense care, each piece recorded and studied, its position noted before the enormous puzzle of reassembly could even be attempted. And that puzzle was formidable indeed, for although the builders had packed the ship away in an orderly fashion, they had not left a written plan, and the modern task was to work out, from the shapes of the timbers themselves, and from the channels and holes cut into them, exactly how each piece was meant to join to its neighbours, and so to rebuild, plank by plank and lashing by lashing, a vessel that no living person had ever seen assembled. The man who took on this extraordinary labour, and whose patience and skill deserved to be remembered alongside the ship itself, was an Egyptian restorer named Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, sometimes known with affection and respect by the title Hag, a man who devoted years of his life to the reconstruction of the buried vessel. His task was one that few could have borne, requiring not only technical skill, but an almost limitless patience, for he had to become, in effect, the pupil of the ancient shipwrights, learning their methods by studying the very pieces they had made, teaching himself to read the language of channels and pegs and rope paths that they had left behind. It is said that he assembled the ship and took it apart again more than once, testing his understanding, correcting his mistakes, refining the fit of the timbers until at last they came together as their makers had intended. Over the course of many years, the ship rose again from its scattered pieces, plank joining to plank, the great hull taking shape once more, the oars set in their places, the cabin reassembled, until the vessel that had been reduced to a puzzle of more than 1,000 parts stood whole again for the first time since the age of the pyramids. To reassemble it was, in a sense, to complete a conversation across 4,500 years, the ancient builders speaking through the shapes they had cut, the modern restorer listening and answering with his hands, the two of them together, though separated by an almost unthinkable gulf of time, raising the same ship. The labour that this required is hard to overstate, and the man who carried it out deserves to be remembered as one of the quiet heroes of the whole story. He was not working from any plan or manual, for none existed. He had before him more than 1,000 pieces of ancient wood, fragile with age, along with the coils of ancient rope, and his task was to discover, by study and by trial, how every one of those pieces was meant to join to its neighbours and then to bring them together into a whole. He worked slowly over years, learning the ways of the ancient shipwrights as he went, and it is said that more than once he assembled the ship only to take it apart again, having found some better understanding of how the pieces should go so that the final vessel was the fruit of repeated effort, of building and unbuilding and building once more, each attempt teaching him a little more about the intentions of the makers. Such patience is itself a kind of genius, the willingness to undo one's own work in the search for a truer result, and the restorer possessed it in full measure. There were dangers at every step, for the ancient timber, though astonishingly well preserved, was not as strong as fresh wood, and had to be handled with the greatest care lest it crack or split under the stresses of reassembly. The old ropes could not simply be drawn tight as they once had been, and much thought had to be given to how the ship should be held together in its reconstructed form without harming the precious original material. The whole enterprise demanded not only the skills of a craftsman, but the caution of a conservator, the constant awareness that these were irreplaceable relics of the deep past, and that a single careless act could destroy in a moment what 4,500 years had spared, that the ship was brought together whole and safely across so long and delicate a labour is a tribute to the care and the devotion of those who did the work, and above all to the restorer whose years of patient effort gave the ancient vessel back its shape. And when it was done, the reward was extraordinary, for the finished ship stood as a thing complete, not a model or a guess, but the very vessel of Khufu's age, raised again after its long burial into the graceful form its makers had given it. Those who saw it could walk its length and take in its scale and marvel that so ancient a thing could be so nearly perfect, and could feel, standing before it, the presence of a world 4,500 years gone. The conversation across the ages had been completed. The ancient builders had spoken through their work and the modern hands had answered, and between them they had raised once more the ship that had waited so long in the dark for exactly this. And when the work was done, and the ship stood whole, it was a revelation. For here was not a reconstruction based on guesswork or on distant analogy, but the actual vessel itself, the very timbers shaped by Egyptian hands in the reign of Khufu, joined once more into the graceful, long, upward curving form that the reed boats of an even older Egypt had first suggested. The ship that had been an idea, a rumour, a scatter of ancient wood in a sealed pit, was now a thing that could be seen and walked around and marvelled at, its scale and its elegance and its extraordinary age all made plain at once. Few discoveries in the long history of Egyptian archaeology have given us so direct and so complete a glimpse into the craft of the Old Kingdom, and few have required so much devoted labour to bring to light. Yet even with the ship reassembled and standing whole, the questions that had gathered around it were not all resolved, and it is only right, in the spirit of honest reckoning with the past, to dwell for a while on the debates that continue to surround the vessel, for they are as much a part of its story as the timbers themselves. We have already touched upon the deepest of these questions, the matter of what the ship was truly for, whether it was a purely symbolic bark built only for the king's imagined voyage through the heavens and the underworld, or a real funeral boat that had carried his body across the water before being laid to rest, or something that partook of both meanings at once. This question has never been finally settled, and the evidence, as we have seen, can be read in more than one way. Those who study the ship have looked closely at the timbers for signs of wear, for marks that might show whether the vessel had ever truly been in the water, and they have not all reached the same conclusion. Some see hints that the ship was used, however briefly. Others see a vessel that never floated at all. The record does not compel us to choose, and the wisest course is to hold both possibilities gently in mind and to let the uncertainty stand. Those who have looked most closely at the ship have weighed a number of small clues, none of them decisive on its own. Some have pointed to marks upon certain timbers that might, they suggest, be signs of wear from use, places where the wood seems to bear the traces of stress or of contact with water, as though the ship had at some time been afloat and under load. Others have examined the ropes and the joints and considered whether they show the kind of strain that a real voyage would impose, or whether they seem instead to have been fitted and never truly tested against the water. The great oars too have been part of the discussion, for some of them seem large and heavy for practical rowing, which has led certain scholars to doubt whether the ship was ever meant to be propelled in earnest, while others reply that a ceremonial royal vessel might well carry oars made grander than mere usefulness would require. Each of these threads has been followed by patient investigators, and each has yielded suggestion rather than proof, so that the question of whether the ship ever floated remains, after all the study, genuinely open. It is possible, some have proposed, that the ship made but a single voyage, the solemn journey that carried the dead king's body across the water to his place of burial, and was then dismantled and laid to rest, its one brief passage upon the Nile being the whole of its life afloat. In this view, the marks of use, if such they are, would be the traces of that one funeral voyage, and the ship would be both a real working vessel and a sacred funerary object at once, the two meanings joined in a single boat. Others hold that the vessel was built purely for burial, a magnificent thing made to be given to the king in his tomb, and never intended to touch the water at all, and that the supposed signs of use can be explained in other ways, as the marks of the ship's building and dismantling rather than of any voyage. Between these readings, the evidence does not allow us to decide with confidence, and it may be that we shall never know for certain which is true. What we can say is that the ship stands at the meeting point of the practical and the sacred, of the real boat and the eternal bark, and that this doubleness, far from diminishing it, is part of what makes it so rich a thing to contemplate, a vessel poised forever between the water of the Nile and the water of the sky. There are other questions too, quieter but no less real. there is the matter of the ship's exact dimensions, which, though known with far more precision than most facts about the ancient world, still admit of small variations depending on how the sweeping curves of the hull are measured and how the figures are rounded, so that different reliable accounts may give slightly different numbers for the length and the breadth, and it is best to speak of the ship as being more than 40 metres long, rather than to insist upon a single exact figure as though it were beyond dispute. There is the question of exactly when, within the reign of Khufu, or perhaps in the reign of his immediate successors, the ship was made and buried, a question bound up with the larger uncertainties of Egyptian chronology, in which the precise dates of even the most famous reigns are known only approximately and are subject to ongoing revision as new evidence and new methods refine our understanding. And there is the question of how the ship relates to the other boat pits at the site and to the whole system of belief that place ships beside the tombs of kings, a subject on which much has been written and about which much remains to be learned. Each of these debates is, in its own way, a reminder that even an object as concrete and as marvellously preserved as the ship of Khufu does not simply hand us the truth about itself. It gives us timber and rope and shape, and it gives us through those things an extraordinary amount of real knowledge, but it also leaves gaps, silences, open questions that the surviving records cannot fill. And rather than paper over those gaps with confident guesses, the honest historian learns to name them, to say plainly where the evidence runs out and the speculation begins, and to find in the open questions themselves a kind of richness, for they keep the ship alive as a subject of wonder and inquiry, rather than closing it off as a solved and finished thing. The ship of Khufu is not a riddle to be triumphantly answered. It is a presence to be studied, patiently and humbly, across generations, each of which adds a little to what is known and leaves the rest, respectfully, open. There is, moreover, a second chapter to the story of the buried boats of Giza, one that unfolded far more recently, and that added greatly to our understanding, for the ship discovered by El-Malak was not the only vessel sealed beside the Great Pyramid. Close beside the first pit lay a second, similarly covered and similarly containing the dismantled timbers of a ship, and although the existence of this second pit was recognised not long after the first was opened, the decision was made not to excavate it immediately, but to leave the second ship sealed and protected for the time being, so that it might be studied later with even greater care and with the benefit of new methods that had not existed when the first ship was found. This patience proved wise, for in the decades that followed, the tools available to archaeologists advanced enormously, and when the time came to investigate the second pit, it could be done in ways that would have been impossible before. In due course, a team of specialists, in which Japanese scholars from a university in Tokyo played a leading part, undertook the careful examination of the second pit, and among the notable moments in that long project was the insertion of a small camera through a tiny opening into the sealed chamber so that the timbers could be seen and photographed before the pit was fully opened, allowing the researchers to plan their work with a knowledge of what lay beneath that El-Malak and his contemporaries had never enjoyed with the first ship. What the camera revealed, and what the later excavation confirmed, was that the second pit did indeed contain the disassembled parts of another large vessel, comparable to the first, though its state of preservation was not as perfect, for the second pit had not been sealed quite so completely, and over the millennia some air and some small creatures had found their way in, so that certain of the timbers had suffered damage that the first ship, in its more airtight tomb, had escaped. The excavation and conservation of this second ship became a project of many years, patient and meticulous, aimed at recovering and preserving as much as possible of a vessel that, though more fragile than its neighbour, was every bit as ancient and every bit as valuable to our understanding of the age. The finding and study of the second ship deepened the picture in important ways, for it confirmed that the burial of boats beside the pyramid was not a single, isolated act, but part of a considered plan, with more than one vessel provided, perhaps answering to the Egyptian idea of the different barks needed for the different stages of the king's eternal voyage, the boat of the day and the boat of the night, the eastward crossing and the westward passage. Two ships, sealed side by side, waiting through the same immense span of centuries, spoke of an intention and a completeness that a single vessel alone could not have shown, and the very difference in their preservation, the near-perfect state of the first and the greater fragility of the second, offered its own quiet lesson in how much the survival of the ancient past depends upon the accidents of sealing and shelter, on whether a tomb was closed tightly or left a little open, on the difference of a few gaps in a covering of stone across 4,500 years. The recovery of the second ship became a long international labour, patient and careful, stretching across many years and drawing upon skills and methods that had not existed when the first ship was found. Where the first vessel had been lifted from its pit and reassembled in an earlier age, with the tools and knowledge of that time, the second could be approached with all the advantages of a later and more cautious science, with the careful recording of every step, the gentle lifting and treating of each fragile piece, and the constant aim of preserving as much of the original material as could be saved. The work was slow by necessity, for haste is the enemy of such conservation, and the timbers of the second ship weakened by the air, and the small creatures that had reached them through the imperfect seal needed even more delicate handling than those of the first. Piece by piece the parts were removed from the pit, cleaned, studied, and stabilized, and the long process of understanding how they fitted together was begun once more, a second great puzzle of ancient timber to set beside the first. There is something fitting in the fact that the second ship was left sealed for so long before it was disturbed, for that patience meant that when the moment came, the vessel could be treated with a care and a knowledge that would have been impossible earlier, and more of it could be saved than might otherwise have been. The decision not to rush, to leave the second pit closed until the science of preservation had matured, was itself a kind of wisdom, a recognition that the ancient ship would keep a little longer in the dark and that it was better to wait and to do the work well than to hurry and to lose what could not be replaced. And the reward of that patience was a fuller understanding of the whole scheme of the buried boats, a second vessel to compare with the first, confirming that the provision of ships for the king's eternal voyage was no single accident, but a deliberate and repeated act, carried out with care on more than one occasion at the foot of the Great Pyramid. Between them, the two ships tell us more than either could alone. They show that the burial of boats beside Khufu's pyramid was part of a considered plan, that at least two great vessels were provided and sealed away with equal care, and that the beliefs which required such provision were held firmly enough to justify the enormous effort of building, dismantling and burying not one full-sized ship but two. And in their differing fates, the one preserved almost perfectly and the other damaged by the slow intrusion of air and time, they teach us to be grateful for the extraordinary good fortune that spared the first ship so completely. For without the accident of that perfect sealing we should never have known, in such vivid and complete detail, what the great boats of the Pyramid Age truly were. In our own time, the story of the first and best preserved ship entered a new phase. For having been reassembled it needed a home, and for many years it was housed in a special building raised directly over the pit in which it had been found, a museum built so that visitors might come and stand before the ancient vessel and take in its scale and its beauty at close hand. But the presence of that building close against the flank of the Great Pyramid was not without difficulty, and in time the decision was taken to move the ship to a new and grander home, a great modern museum built to gather together the treasures of ancient Egypt. And so, in a remarkable operation, the reassembled vessel was carefully transported across the desert to its new resting place. To move so ancient and so fragile a ship, whole, across a distance of some kilometres, was itself a considerable feat of engineering and care, requiring a specially built vehicle and the most painstaking planning, so that the timbers that had survived 4,500 years in the ground should not be harmed in a journey of a few hours. For many years before that move, the reassembled ship had been housed in a building raised directly over the pit in which it had been found, close against the southern flank of the Great Pyramid, a museum built so that visitors might come and stand before the ancient vessel where it had lain. There the ship rested for decades, seen by many thousands of travellers who came to Giza to marvel at the pyramids, and found, beside the greatest of them, this astonishing survivor of the Pyramid Age. But the arrangement was not without its difficulties. A building set so close against the pyramid was itself a kind of intrusion upon the ancient monument, and the conditions within it were not ideal for the long-term preservation of so delicate a thing. For a wooden ship of such age needs a carefully controlled environment, steady and cool and dry, if it is to endure. In time it was judged better to give the ship a new home, one built with the care and the knowledge that its preservation demanded, and to free the flank of the pyramid from the building that had stood against it. And so the decision was taken to move the vessel to a great new museum, raised nearby to gather together the treasures of ancient Egypt under one roof, and there to house the ship in conditions worthy of it. The care of so ancient a vessel, once it had been raised again into its graceful shape, was a task without end, for a ship of wood 4,500 years old is a fragile and demanding thing, and its survival, having been secured across the long burial by the accident of a good sealing, now depended upon the constant vigilance of those who kept it. Wood, even the durable and fragrant cedar of Lebanon, is a living material that responds to the world around it, swelling when the air is damp and shrinking when it is dry. And across many such cycles, even the soundest timber may crack or warp or weaken. To keep the ancient ship safe, therefore, meant keeping the air around it steady and still, neither too moist nor too dry, holding the temperature and the humidity within careful bounds, so that the timbers should not be made to swell and shrink and be slowly worked apart by the very breathing of the atmosphere. This is among the quiet difficulties of preserving such a thing, and it was among the reasons that the building first raised over the pit came in time to seem unsuitable. For a structure set out in the heat and glare beside the pyramid could not easily hold the gentle, unchanging conditions that the fragile vessel required. There were other dangers too, against which those who kept the ship had always to be watchful. Light itself, especially the strong light of the sun, can harm old organic material across the years, fading and weakening it, and so the ship had to be sheltered from too fierce an illumination, shown in a softened and controlled light rather than exposed to the blaze of day. The small creatures that feed upon wood, the insects that can bore into ancient timber and reduce it slowly to powder, had to be guarded against with equal care, for a vessel that had survived so many thousands of years could yet be lost to such humble enemies if they were allowed to reach it. Dust and pollution, the smoke and grime of the modern world could settle upon the surfaces and do their slow damage, and had to be kept away. The keeping of the ship, in short, was a ceaseless and patient labour of protection, a matter of watching and measuring and adjusting, of holding at bay all the many forces that would, if left unchecked, undo across a few generations what the sealed pit had preserved across so many. It was in large part for the sake of this careful keeping that the decision came at last to move the ship to a new home, a great modern museum built with all the knowledge of preservation that the age could bring to bear, where the vessel could be housed in conditions designed from the first to protect it, the air controlled, the light softened, the temperature held steady, the whole environment shaped around the single aim of letting the ancient ship endure as long as possible into the future. To build such a home was itself a considerable work, and it reflected a change in how the treasures of the past had come to be regarded, no longer merely displayed but actively conserved, tended by specialists whose whole concern was the long survival of the objects in their charge. The ship that had been saved once by the unknowing thoroughness of its ancient builders was now to be saved again, deliberately this time, by the knowing care of a later age, and given every advantage that patient science could provide against the slow erosions of time. There is a pleasing symmetry in this, for the ship owed its first survival to the care of the people who had sealed it away so completely, and it owed its continuing survival to the care of those who now kept it, two acts of protection separated by the whole length of recorded history, and yet joined in their common purpose, the wish that this beautiful and ancient thing should not be allowed to perish. The ancient builders had wrapped the ship in stone and stillness and left it to the dark. The modern keepers wrapped it in controlled air and softened light and constant watchfulness, and kept it in the open view of the world. Between those two forms of care the ship passed safely down the ages, and by them it is guarded still, so that the labour of the old kingdom shipwrights, and the patience of the restorer who raised their work again, should not be lost but should endure, whole and honoured, far into a future that neither the builders nor the finders could ever have foreseen. The move itself, when it came, was carried out with the greatest possible caution, for the risk in transporting so ancient a ship whole and intact across even a short distance was considerable. The vessel was enclosed within a protective frame and mounted upon a specially made transporter, a vehicle designed to move slowly and smoothly and to cushion its precious burden against every jolt and vibration, and it was carried across the desert to its new home over the course of the hours at a careful and unhurried pace, watched over at every moment. Every precaution was taken to ensure that the timbers, having survived so much, should come to no harm in this last short journey of their long existence. And when it was done, the ship had reached a new resting place built to keep it safe far into the future, a home where the conditions could be controlled and the vessel preserved for generations yet to come, so that people not yet born might one day stand before it as we do, and feel the same wonder at its age and its grace and its improbable survival. The ship made the passage safely, and found its new home, where it may be seen today, one of the great treasures not only of Egypt, but of the whole human record. The oldest large ship in the world to survive very nearly whole, resting now under modern light after its long, long voyage through time. When we stand back from the long chronicle of the ship, from its building and its burial and its finding and its keeping, and ask what, in the end, it has given us, the answer is larger than the vessel itself, for the buried boat has taught the modern world a great deal about the age that made it, and has quietly overturned some of the easy assumptions that were once made about the people of that distant time. It is tempting, looking back across so vast a gulf of years, to imagine the men and women of the Old Kingdom as simpler than ourselves, their skills cruder, their understanding narrower, their works the product of brute effort rather than of real knowledge and art. The ship gives the lie to that comfortable condescension. Here is a vessel more than 40 meters long, designed with a sure sense of proportion and grace, built from carefully chosen and imported timber, joined by a sophisticated and well-understood method into a single elegant whole, and finished with a precision that the eye still admires across the reach of the ages. It is the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing, who commanded a mature and confident craft, and who brought to their task a mastery that no one who looks upon their achievement can honestly deny. The ship speaks, too, of the reach and the organization of the world that produced it, of a state able to send its ships across the sea for the finest timber, to gather and direct the many hands of many trades, to command the resources and the patience that so great a work required, and to fold the making of the vessel into the still vaster enterprise of the pyramid and its whole complex of monuments. To build the ship was not a thing that could be done by a lone craftsman in a season, but demanded the felling of foreign forests, the crossing of the sea, the labour of carpenters and rope makers and haulers and scribes, the whole apparatus of a rich and well-ordered kingdom bent toward a single sacred end. That such a kingdom existed so early, capable of such coordinated and sustained achievement, is one of the quiet lessons of the ship, a reminder of how far the human capacity for organisation and craft had already come at the very dawn of recorded history, thousands of years before the ages we are apt to think of as the beginning of civilization's great works. And beyond all this, the ship gives us something that mere knowledge cannot quite contain, a direct and almost physical connection to a moment of the human past that is otherwise unreachable. To read about the Old Kingdom is one thing. To stand before an actual object made by its hands, whole and real and present, is another entirely. The ship is not a reconstruction, not a guess, not a drawing based upon faded evidence, but the very timber that Egyptian craftsmen shaped in the reign of Khufu, the actual wood their tools cut and their ropes bound, come down to us across the whole of history unbroken. To be in its presence is to be brought, as near as any object can bring us, into the company of those long-vanished makers, to feel the reality of their existence and their skill, to sense that they were people as real and as capable as ourselves, who lived and worked beneath the same sun, and looked up at the same wheeling stars, and who left behind, in this one improbable survivor, a message that needs no words, a plain and eloquent testimony to what they were and what they could do. There is a further thought, quieter still, that the ship seems to hold out to anyone who considers it long enough. It is that the things we make with care may outlast not only ourselves but the whole world we know, and may carry some part of us forward into a future we cannot imagine, to be received by hands and eyes we will never meet. The builders of the ship worked for their king and their gods, within the beliefs and the purposes of their own time, and could have had no notion of the strangers who would one day uncover their work and marvel at it. And yet their care reached those strangers all the same, across an almost unthinkable gulf of years, and speaks to them, to us, as clearly as if it had been meant for us all along. In that there is something both humbling and consoling, a sense that the patient good work of human hands has a way of enduring, of keeping faith across the centuries, of carrying meaning forward through the dark far longer and far further than its makers could ever have dreamed. And here, with the ship at rest in its new home, its timbers preserved, its story told as far as the record allows, we may pause and let our thoughts drift back across the whole of the journey we have followed, from the forests of Lebanon to the shipyards of the Nile, from the ceiling of the pit to the long silence of the centuries, from the moment the ancient cedar was breathed again in 1954 to the patient labour of reassembly and the ship's final passage to its modern resting place. It is a story that spans an almost unimaginable reach of time, and yet at its heart it is a simple and human story. The story of people who built something beautiful with great care, and of other people thousands of years later who found it and cherished it and worked with equal care to bring it back into the light. Between those two acts of care lies the whole of recorded history, and the ship carried its maker's intentions across all of it, faithfully in the dark. There is something in the ship of Khufu that speaks to the deepest impulses of the people who build things, the wish to make something that will outlast the maker, that will carry a name or a hope or a belief forward into a future the builder will never see. The king who ordered the ship meant it to carry him across the boundary of death and into an eternity among the gods, and whether or not that voyage happened in the way he imagined, the ship did in fact carry something across an eternity, for it carried the memory and the craft of his age, whole and intact across 4,500 years into a world he could never have foreseen, where it is honoured still. The shipwrights who shaped the cedar meant only, perhaps, to do their work well and to satisfy their king, and in doing so they made an object that would become, long after their names were forgotten, one of the most precious surviving works of the ancient world. There is a lesson in that, quiet and consoling, about how the careful work of ordinary hands can reach far beyond any purpose its makers intended, enduring when so much else has crumbled away. And there is, too, a lesson in water, and in the long human contest with it, of which the ship is a part. From the first bundles of reed lashed together to float upon the marshes of the Nile, through the sewn cedar hull of Khufu's bark, and on through all the great ships that would come after, down all the centuries to the vessels of our own age, people have bent timber and rope and metal and skill toward the same ancient wish, to cross the water, to master it, to be carried upon it toward some further shore. The ship of Khufu stands very near the beginning of that long line, one of the earliest of its members to survive so that we might see it, and to stand before it is to stand at the head of a procession of great ships stretching away into the future, each one heir to the same patient craft, the same meeting of ambition and material, the same slender hope of floating something large and precious across the deep. The ship never sailed the sea, and yet it belongs entirely to the story of those who did, the first of the great preserved ships, keeping faith across the ages with all the ships that would come after it. So let us leave the ship where it rests now, whole and quiet under the museum's light, its cedar timbers holding still the shape that Egyptian hands gave them in the reign of a pharaoh, whose pyramid was new when the vessel was laid in the ground. Let us imagine one last time the empty pit beside the Great Pyramid, cut into the living rock, its great limestone roof long since lifted away, the space where the ship waited through so many silent centuries now open to the desert air. Let us imagine the still water of the imagined heavens that the ship was meant to cross, the calm eternal river of the Egyptian sky, upon which the sun makes its endless voyage from dawn to dusk, and through the hidden hours of the night to dawn again. And let us imagine the ship itself, not broken into its 1,000 pieces, not sealed in the dark, but whole and graceful and ready, its long hull rising at each end into those slender curving points, its oars at rest, its canopies raised, poised forever at the edge of a voyage it was built to make, across water no one can see, toward a shore no traveller has ever described. If you have found some measure of rest in the long, slow telling of this ship's story, you are gently welcome to return whenever you wish, for there are many more great ships waiting quietly in the deep of history, each with its own long voyage to tell, and each ready, whenever you are, to carry you softly towards sleep.